nerds, what's up? Welcome to my guide to secret project number 4, or the Sunlit Man, to help you get every Cosmere reference that was mentioned. Now, doesn't it seem like just yesterday we all thought Brandon Sanderson was dying of a terminal illness? Good times. It's a little bittersweet that this is our last secret project to go over together, but man, it has been a fun ride. So I have several topics we're going to cover today, but one thing I will say is I had a few comments on my last videos asking that I be more explicit about which book things come from when I mention them, like planet names, because a lot of people said I can't always keep them straight. So this video, I'm going to try to make sure to do that. Let me know if that's helpful in the comments below, because I'm sure I will have many Cosmere videos in the future, and I'd like to know if that was helpful. If you want to know a rundown of the topics I'm going to go over today, I have put them in the chapters below so you can kind of skip to the things that interest you most. And yeah, there was a lot in this one. Very Stormlight Archive related, so I am extremely excited. And you can also check out my overall rating and thoughts at the end of this video. Without further ado, see you after the jump. So the first topic I'm going to start with is obviously Sigzil, our main character, also known as Nomad or Zelion by the end of this. And Sigzil is obviously from the Stormlight Archive. He is a member of Bridge 4. Now, Stormlight Archive takes place on the planet of Roshar, and Sigzil makes so many mentions to Roshar throughout this book. Like, at first I thought, oh, it's going to be subtle. Absolutely not. Completely not subtle. I started marking every mention of Roshar in the book, and then eventually it was so many I got bored. But before I got bored marking them, I caught things like using storms as a curse, mention of plants that usually move or dodge, shard blades, corrupted spren, talking about being airsick or airsick lowlander, the Alethi, Kaladin, Alethkar, the high storms, journeys before destination, long eyebrows, the irony of talking about unite them, cryptic spren, mentions of damnation, bridge 4, knights radiant, and high spren. There were more than that, but that's what I got to before I got bored. So clearly a Rosharian person if we didn't already know it was Sigzil. So what's really interesting is we obviously knew Sigzil had an honor spren because he was a windrunner as far as we know in Stormlight Archive. What I find very interesting is in this book, it lets us know that he abandoned those oaths and killed his spren. Now in this book, we see him with a high spren, which high spren are associated with the Order of Skybreakers. So at some point, Sigzil became a Skybreaker, and we know he had to be at least of the 4th ideal because he had his armor. Now you could say, well, maybe the armor was associated with the 4th ideal of his honor spren, but it specifically says in the book that he lost, or his armor was taken from him by the Dawnshard. So my assumption is that he had to at least have that armor with auxiliary. One thing I do think is interesting though, at one point Ox asks Sigzil what oaths when he's saying something about that. And I'm trying to decide, like, does that what oaths mean? He's asking, are you talking about your former Windrunner oaths or your Skybreaker oaths? Or is he saying that him and Ox currently aren't oathed? But I feel like that's not, we don't know that that's possible right now, that they'd be that connected without oaths. So I'm going to assume maybe it was the former. We also find out that Ox is injured, and it was something that happened while Sigzil took the Dawnshard from Wit. What I think is interesting is we were just kind of starting to explore different ways that spren can be injured and dead spren, and more like at the end of the Stormlight Archive, especially Rhythm of War. So I find it interesting that we're kind of adding this to the lore of, wow, you could take enough investiture from a spren to keep it alive, but not fully itself. So I think that's a very interesting new thing to explore, and it makes me very nervous for Stormlight Archive 5, but we don't need to talk about that yet. Something else that also surprised me is that it's implied that Sigzil didn't meet Ox on Roshar, because let me read the quote. It specifically says, it reminded him of another place, another world he'd once traveled, a place where he'd met auxiliary. So that was strange to me that he met Ox off of Roshar, at least according to my reading of that quote. As far as timeline goes, Sigzil mentions that he was with auxiliary for decades and decades before the thing happened, which I'm assuming is the injury to Ox. So my guess is most of this is probably going down in the second half or the back half of the Stormlight Archive, since we know there is a time jump between the first 5 books and the last 5 books of the Stormlight Archive. That's my reading of this. Maybe we'll find out more information of this then. I'm assuming we are, hopefully. He does mention he was 38 when the Dawnshards stopped aging him, which is also confusing now that I think about it, because how could he have been with auxiliary for decades and decades if he's only 38? How old is he in the Stormlight Archive? Because I couldn't find, but he couldn't have been younger than Kaladin based on just his history with Wit and being a world singer. So, okay, sorry. That timeline doesn't make sense when he's saying they'd been together for decades until the day. Maybe he had the Dawnshard for a bit before Auxiliary was injured. That must be the only way. People better with timelines, you can tell me in below, but that's the information we have currently. We also got introduced to a new planet called Canticle. Santicle, yeah, you know what? Whatever pronunciation. No shard, as far as we know, is on this planet, so just kind of a new system. We saw the new way the Investiture kind of goes and are introduced to a new magic system. What's interesting is on this planet, it is clearly people from Thanati, which is the planet that you would know from Shadows for Silence in the Forest of Hell, which is a novella found in Arcanum Unbounded. Previously, I think we had already known that the inhabitants of the people we see in Silence for the Forest of Hells, they were escaping some evil on the main continent. So it was interesting to find out that some of the people from Thanati actually went off-world to escape that evil. So that's definitely probably something that's going to be developed more in the future. We also see some other cultural imports from Thanati, like the names, but that's pretty clearly mentioned by Sigzil, so I don't think we really need to cover that more. Next, let's talk about Investiture. So I thought it was really interesting to hear about BEUs, or breath equivalency units, which is the first time we've heard that phrase. And I think we've gotten a little hints in past books that we'd start seeing breaths as like the common denominator, but it is interesting that it's now formalized, like breaths are how we are measuring investiture in the Cosmere. We talk about the investiture from Nalthis a few times. We talk about breaths, we talk about my breath becomes yours, and we also talk about things being awakened. Some other times investiture is mentioned. We talk about anti-investiture, which we've most recently learned about from Rhythm of War. We also mention Dor from Elantris and Zephyr Ether from Tress of the Emerald Sea. We mention an Awakened Steelmind, using both the magics from Warbreaker and Scadrial or Mistborn. And then Taldane is also mentioned when we talk about light being invested. They're talking about the sun. Taldane is the planet from White Sand. Next, let's talk about Dawnshards. So this was actually pretty exciting for me because the only other big source of knowledge we've got about Dawnshards are from the novella Dawnshard, who would have guessed, as a part of the Stormlight Archive novellas. So it was pretty cool to see Dawnshards kind of explored some more, especially Hoid's Dawnshard, which we've known has caused him some problems in the past, so it was cool to see some more of that. So yes, we previously known that Hoid carried a Dawnshard, and that's what made it so he could not harm anyone, because the Dawnshard he carried is super opposed or against harming people, so that rubs off and you are not allowed to. I had always assumed that this was because Hoid still held it, and the minute he got rid of the Dawnshard, it would stop. So maybe other people knew this, but it was new information for me that once you gave up the Dawnshard, that problem could still persist with you. So that was interesting to see that Sigzil still has that issue. Although I did find it interesting to note that Hoid and Sigzil, the problem affects them in different ways. It seemed much more extreme for Hoid than it is for Sigzil, because he can kind of get around it by following his oaths, and also at the end when he kind of siphons off some of his soul or whatever. And so I thought that was interesting. I wonder if it's because Hoid held the Dawnshard for longer, or if it's just affects different people differently. So we know the Dawnshard gave Sigzil his skipping power and also the power to metabolize breaths, but it seems that the skipping power was not given to Hoid, because it specifically says, Hoid tells Sigzil in this book that he's seen more of the Cosmere than Hoid himself has, which I thought was really interesting because I would not have guessed that. But Hoid can't move like that, so I wonder why the Dawnshard kind of bestowed that power on Sigzil and not Hoid, as far as I know. I also think it's new information that Dawnshards are always connected to you and the people who held it, and that if people find you and kill you and turn you into a spike, they can find the Dawnshard through you. I don't think we knew that Dawnshard stayed connected to you in that way. Next, let's quickly talk about the Night Brigade. I think this is the first time we've heard of them. I don't think we know anything about the Night Brigade other than they're people from Threnody. I don't think we know who the Admiral is or who Truth is Waiting is. I do know that the Night Brigade is a working title for the book Brandon plans to write about Threnody, because that's always been a part of his Cosmere plan. So I'm just gonna assume we're gonna learn more about them in that book, or maybe in future novellas or books. Who knows? Who knows what Brandon's gonna write at this point? I also want to quickly talk about Scadrial. Scadrial is the planet from Mistborn. They're often brought up in these secret projects because they were the most advanced in the Cosmere. We see a couple more things about them, that they have kind of these secret way stations where they research Investiture and research people. We were also introduced to a Scadrian authorization key, which we had never seen before, so that was nice to see. It's also talking about Malwish being the civilized language. Do you know a civilized language? So I think it's interesting that the Malwish kind of are the people that are considered like the civilized or the language that came out of Scadrial. I don't think that's a huge surprise seeing where the Lost Metal went, so it'll be interesting to see how that is reflected in Mistborn Era 3. We are also introduced to the Scadrial political movement, the Time Tellers, which I do not believe we've heard of before or have seen before. My guess is all of these things will be appearing in Mistborn Era 3. Okay, and finally I want to talk about some other random Cosmere mentions on my list here that didn't really fit anywhere else, but I thought would be fun to mention. So the first is that Sigzil says he's seen flying cities on a planet near his homeworld. I'm assuming he's talking about Ashen because people had to kind of abandon the surface and most people went to Roshar, but anyone who's still there we know is living on floating cities. So I'm assuming he's talking about that. Ashen is often talked about as the Tranquilin Halls in the Stormlight Archive. I'm only laughing because I had to try to say that word like 3 times. It wasn't coming out of my mouth. Ad nauseam is also mentioned several times. I feel like this used to be more exciting, but now with Secret Projects and the Lost Metal, we're just kind of used to it. But yeah, as a reminder, that was before all the shards were splintered. That was, the big god. Sig said maybe one was secretly a dragon, which I thought was a fun nod to cultivation. As a reminder, cultivation is a shard found on Roshar, which is the planet in the Stormlight Archive. We know cultivation is a dragon. We obviously see Wit. That's not very exciting anymore either because of Secret Projects. We're kind of used to him now. It's been kind of fun. Again, I find it very interesting that he says Sig has seen more of the Cosmere than he has. Would not expect that. We mentioned Yolen a few times. Yolen is the place where the shattering happened and is also the place where Hoyd is from. There's also a mention of the Shodel at the very end of this book, and the Shodel are one of the 3 species besides humans and dragons that are found on Yolen. I think we also mentioned Shodel in Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. It was definitely one of the other Secret Projects. I don't think it was Tress, I think it was Yumi. Silverlight is mentioned several times in this book as like their guidebooks are mentioned. As a reminder, Silverlight is a huge city in the cognitive realm where most of the world hoppers kind of like meet and hang out, and some of them even reside there. Most of what we know of Silverlight is from like extra material from Words of Brandon, so I wouldn't be surprised if maybe you haven't heard of that before. I think it's briefly maybe mentioned in Rhythm of War, I want to say, and potentially the end of Lost Metal, some of the later books that have been more recently published. But yes, that was fun to see that mentioned. Also, Town Scar is mentioned, which is a really bright section of stars. And fun fact, those stars are also seen from Threnody, but it's known as the Star Belt. It can also be seen on Scadrial, and it's known as the Red Rip. And finally, I always like to talk about timeline. As far as timeline goes, I did mention briefly how confused I was by the decades thing in Auxiliary and how that's working with his Honor Spren and High Spren, which I'm thinking we're just gonna have to read Stormlight Archive to really figure out what's going on there. But Sig also mentions a quote that says, "Something has been lost with the ease by which people now went from world to world," which implies that world hopping is done very easily and frequently. And then he also says that space travel wasn't routine until the last 100 years or so, but the science was old depending on the part of the Cosmere you visited. So I think we're pretty far ahead. It also gives us a hint of how long Sig has been alive, so clearly hundreds of years. I'm gonna say it, I've said it every Secret Project, I think this is the latest of the Cosmere that's been published. It feels the most late stage in my opinion. You guys tell me below, but I thought Yumi was the latest in the Cosmere, and then I thought Yumi was the latest, and now I just feel like each Secret Project got just a little later in the Cosmere. Okay, those were all of the Cosmere mentions I found in the book. Let me know if I missed anything. As far as my overall thoughts, just quickly at the end here, I gave The Sunlit Man a 4. I enjoyed this book. It's gonna be hard for me not to enjoy it, seeing Sigzil just, a known and beloved character, all of the Rosharian things. I'm probably the most connected to Stormlight Archive, so just being able to see Spren again and how that worked. And I found like the ending very emotional and how things went between him and his Spren. I really enjoyed that. I always enjoy seeing a new planet. It's been one of the coolest parts to me about the Cosmere books in these Secret Projects is being on those new planets and seeing those new magic systems. I always love it. It's one of the reasons I love Sanderson is the way he uses magic and planets and that imagination. And so I'm just always gonna love that. It missed being like the higher scores that I've given The Secret Project, just for a couple of reasons. The biggest one feeling that Sigzil's voice didn't seem quite right to me. You know, we know him as more like the formal one, based on his culture on Roshar. And look, I know it's been hundreds of years, and I know there's tons of in-story reasons why he would feel like a completely different character, having, you know, abandoned his honor spren and now as a skybreaker in this Dawnshard and being with Voidmore and traveling for hundreds. Like, I understand that he shouldn't be the same character we know him as. And I know that I don't think we've gotten any like perspectives from him in the Stormlight Archive. My issue is he just sounded a little like Wit to me. And I know you're gonna say, well, Wit was his, mentor. Wit was his mentor. I totally get that. I think for me, because 2 of the 3 of these secret projects have been narrated by Wit, it felt too much like being just in Wit's head again. The pithy remarks just felt like Wit again. And I think for me, the story would have just worked a little better if we had gotten to see this story from a slightly different perspective. For me personally, one that would have been just a little bit maybe more formal or a little bit more how I view Sigzil. So that kind of just was an undercurrent of the whole book that didn't like make the book bad in any way for me, but did just make it a little less connected for me. It also was extremely action-packed. Perhaps too action-packed. I hate that I'm always like, Sanderson, just write it longer, just a little longer. Can the books all be just a little longer? Oh, one other thing before I end. I do think this is the first like standalone Cosmere book that I think you can't just read whenever you want. I know I just like a few weeks ago posted about how I literally thought you could start any Cosmere book start with any series or any standalone book and it did not matter. And I stand by that until the Sunlit Man. I just think it would be hard to read this book without any Stormlight Archive knowledge. My dad is planning on reading this book. I will update you. He has not read the Stormlight Archive, but he has read Mistborn and the other secret projects. So I will update you on what he thinks of the book, but I'd love to know your thoughts on that. I feel like you have to read at least through Words of Radiance to get some context for this book. You let me know what you think though. Okay, tell me all of your Cosmere theories in the comments below. I feel like personally this book has given me a lot of thoughts about Stormlight Archive 5 and none of them are good, which is worrisome because I was already worried about my heart being ripped out of my chest in Stormlight Archive 5 and I am now more worried. So let me know on a scale of 1 to 10 how much more worried Secret Project 4 made you about how sad Stormlight Archive 5 is going to be. Let me know what you thought of the book, like what rating you gave it, where it stands with the other secret projects, any Cosmere mentions I missed, as always. If you like this kind of content and want to know more about the Cosmere or follow my other things, please like and subscribe. That's the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.